almost every decision that you make has at least some uncertainty in it, whether it's what to eat, like you had to decide now, or what profession to take to become a physicist or a physician, or where to live. This is my street in New Haven in the last snow blizzard, so not too much uncertainty here, but still some uncertainty. And I think that one of the main functions of the brain is really to try and reduce this uncertainty. And if we think just about this simple decision, what to have for lunch, a chocolate cake or some carrots, the general idea is that you assign values to the different options, and then you choose the value of the highest option. But even such a simple decision has many factors that go into it. So there are some positive factors and some negative factors. And the same factor could be positive for some people and negative for other people. High calories may be good for some people and bad for others. More than that, some of the consequences of your decision are certain. So you know for sure that the chocolate cake will be sweet. Other consequences, for example, whether or not you'll gain weight in the future because you ate this chocolate cake, is less certain. So what we can take out of this is that, first of all, valuation is a subjective matter. And second, values are affected, or subjective values are affected by uncertainty. And this is what my lab studies. I'll talk today a little bit about choice behavior in young adults, mainly in order to present the paradigm and how we think about these things. And then a little bit about the neural mechanisms. Then I'll talk about how these things change, or at least how the behavior change across the lifespan. And in the end, because people here are interested in interventions, I'll talk a little bit about a little intervention that we're trying to do in order to change biases. So because most of you are economists, I'm sure you know much more about this than me, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'll start with some definitions. So it turns out that there are several different types of uncertainty. And specifically, I'll start with a couple of examples. So suppose you have to choose between $40 for sure or this lottery. This is a bag that contains 100 red and blue poker chips, and 50 are red and 50 are blue. And I tell you, if you draw a red chip, you'll get $100. And you get nothing for blue. So this is a risky lottery. You have a 50% chance of gaining $100. And as you know, most people will go for the certain amount, although on average you can get $50 here. The expected value is $50. Now suppose you have to make this choice between the risky lottery that you saw before and this other lottery, also a bag that contains 100 red and blue poker chips. But now you don't know how many are red and how many are blue. So this is an ambiguous lottery. And when people have to choose on what to bet, they tend to choose A, even though here you can get $100 for a red chip, and here you can get $110 for a red chip. This pays more. So by choosing A, people behave as if they believe that B has less red than blue chips in it. Because otherwise, of course, it makes no sense to choose an option that pays less and has a low winning probability.
You're making an assumption on preferences.
Sorry?
You seem to be making an assumption on preferences.
I'm not saying that that's what the assumption that people make. I'm just saying that, this option is, this option pays more than this option. So if people obey, first order stochastic dominance, then they should choose this unless this has a higher winning probability.
What I'm trying to do, so for what it's worth, economists actually would disagree with that statement.
Okay.
Because you're presupposing that the person's trying to maximize the expected payoff. And a different question is, well, so I guess have preferences over different outcomes.
I'm suggesting that they're trying to maximize expected utility, not necessarily the expected payoff. But keep that.
The expected utility is where the question, that's even rejected.
Okay, so you know what? Even regardless of what people do here, suppose now we keep the same bags with the same chips in them, and we switch the probabilities, and we switch the payoffs, sorry. So now blue is the winning color, red is not winning, and again, $100 here and $110 here. And when people have to choose again, on which lottery to bet, again, they tend to choose A. And although these are the same physical bag. So, I don't know what you think about this, but we can say, and this is also true if you ask people to choose the winning color and then to bet on this or that. Still, they always prefer, or not always, but usually prefer the risky option over the ambiguous option. And
if you possible, if you just are on the other side of the screen.
Oh, sorry.
People on this side are today. Thank you. That's great.
Okay.
Are you okay? I'm fine.
Yeah. That's it. So this is what's known as the Ellsberg paradox, and it's just to show, regardless of, any assumptions, just to show that people usually prefer to avoid ambiguous options. That's all I'm saying. And so risk is when we know the probabilities, ambiguity is when we don't, and I will use this condition of partial ambiguity, which is when we have some of the information about the probabilities, but not all of the information. So this is an occluder that occludes some of the contents of the bag. And so in most of the experiments, what we have is subjects make a series of choices between usually a certain amount, in this case always $5, and a lottery. So this represents a bag, again, with 100 poker chips in it. And we have the red and blue areas and little numbers representing the numbers of red and blue chips. And then the occluder, in some of the cases, that hides some of the information. So what's behind the occluder could be all red, all blue, or any combination of red and blue. And we have the amounts attached with the red and blue, $20 for red in this case. And we use a parametric design in which we change the amounts that can be made, the probabilities for these amounts, and the ambiguity levels around these probabilities, so how much is unknown. We also change the winning color. In half the trials it's red, in half the trials it's blue. We also have loss trials in which subjects choose between two possible losses. And so in the beginning of the experiment, we endow them with an amount of money that they can afterwards lose. We use real bags. So each image in the experiment refers to a real bag with physical poker chips in it. And so subjects know that although in principle, if they see this image, there could be many distributions of red and blue behind it, in fact, it always refers to a single bag with a distribution that was predefined before the experiment. And at the end of the experiment, we select one trial and play it for real money. And so if you think about it, this design ensures that in all of these ambiguous cases, the objective winning probability is 50%, regardless of the ambiguity level. And so this is the behavior of one subject. X-axis is the amount that was offered on each trial. Y-axis is the proportion of trials in which this subject chose the lottery and not the sure amount. And we can start with risky trials with gains and with a probability of 75%. When we offered $5, of course, this subject never chose it. But then when we offered more and more money, the subject chose the lottery more and more. And the indifference point was around $8 here. And then when we lowered the winning probability, she chose the lottery less and less. So she was very lawful in her behavior. And then we can do the same thing for ambiguity trials. This is the lowest ambiguity level, the second ambiguity level. And at the highest ambiguity level, the subject never chose the lottery until we offered $125. So she was very averse to ambiguity. If you think about it, because the objective probability in all of these ambiguous cases was 50%, if she was rational or trying to maximize the payoffs, then she should have made the same choices under all of these conditions, and she didn't. So this particular subject was very affected by ambiguity. And we use a model to fit these choices. The specific model is not really important. What matters is that we model the subjective values that the different options had to each individual subject. In this case, we use just a simple power utility function that has an addition of this term based on Gilboa and Schmidler that takes into account the individual attitude towards ambiguity. And so we just have, for each trial, the objective parameters of the trial, and then the two subject-specific parameters that take into account the individual's risk attitude and ambiguity attitude. And we use this in a stochastic choice model to find these alpha and beta for each of our subjects. This is, again, the same subject that you saw. And just for convenience, I'm going to use negative numbers here for aversion and positive numbers for seeking. So this subject was averse to both risk and ambiguity, as we saw. But this is a second subject that had a similar attitude towards risk, but wasn't averse to ambiguity at all. Her curves were really on top of each other, as we could expect from a rational decision maker. This is, again, the same subject and how she behaved under losses. So as we know from prospect theory and many studies, subjects usually tend to be risk averse with gains and risk seeking with losses, and that's what we see with this subject. But interestingly, in ambiguity, the subject that showed strong ambiguity aversion under gains was not averse to ambiguity at all under losses. And this is the subject population in this study. It's hard to see here, but this is just to show that there was a lot of variability. Although, on average, most subjects were averse to risk and ambiguity under gains and not under losses, there was a lot of variability, and there didn't seem to be any correlation between attitudes under gains and losses, and not strong correlation, although there may have been a slight correlation between attitudes towards risk and ambiguity. So it seems as if we have 4 parameters, attitudes towards risk and ambiguity under gains and under losses, that are largely independent from each other. And so it's interesting to look at all of these parameters when we look at different populations. It's also interesting to think what happens in the brain. Because risk and ambiguity seem to be so different from each other and behavior is so different under these 2 conditions, can we identify 2 separate systems in the brain for risk and ambiguity? So this is just summary of the behavior. And our neural question is basically, we can calculate these subjective values of the risky and ambiguous options, as you saw. Will we find in the brain 2 different valuation systems representing this value in these 2 very different conditions? Or can we identify at some point along the neural pathway a system that maintains a unified valuation of these 2 different domains? And so we're using functional MRI. And as you know, what we do is subjects basically do the experiment, a very similar experiment to what I presented just in the gain domain. They do it in the scanner. They see the stimuli. They press buttons to make the responses. And we record brain activation while they're doing it. So we sample the brain every 2 seconds. And we get basically slight changes in gray levels of the image across the time. So this is a vector of activation in each point of the brain across the experiment. And so we can take the subjective values, we can calculate the subjective values of the different options that were presented during the experiment because we have the behavior of each subject. So we can calculate for each individual subject what each option was worth to them individually. And we can construct these predictors of subjective values under risk. Yes?
Are you choosing them all when they see the lottery or when they take the decision?
If this takes everything together, the entire trial as one event. We did have, it was a slow design, so we had 2 seconds of presentation, then 6 seconds of delay, then they made the response. But whether we looked at each phase separately or we looked at everything together, it was basically the same thing. So we just lumped the entire trial together.
And there was no feedback?
No feedback. And so we have subjective values under risk, subjective values under ambiguity. We can convolve them with a hemodynamic response function to make them more similar to what we actually get from the fMRI, which is not the actual neural activation. And then we can look for brain areas that are correlated with one or the other predictor or both. And we started with looking for correlation with subjective value under ambiguity. And we found these 4 areas, an area in medial prefrontal cortex, a more posterior area in the parietal cortex, and in the parietal cortex, the striatum here, and the amygdala. And these are areas that have been implicated in valuation in many other studies. But now the question is, what happens in risk? Will we see the same areas. And we do see the medial prefrontal cortex and the striatum. We didn't see, even at a very liberal threshold, we didn't see the posterior area, the posterior cingulate cortex or the amygdala. So at this point, it seemed like maybe these areas do something that is specific to ambiguity, to the processing of ambiguity.
And then as a losses and gains at the same.
So here it's only gains in this experiment. We're just doing losses now. But the next thing we did is we sample actually.
Are these only males or only?
No, males and females, about half and half. No, but we didn't have enough statistical power for this. So this is 20 subjects. But even now that we have behavioral results.
So it's not on the level of regions of activation?
Sorry?
So not on the, say, the strength of the activation, but on which region?
Nothing, but again, we didn't have enough power for this. So.
Was there an amygdala? Was there an amygdala with ambiguity?
Yeah, but if so Aldo was, I didn't mention that Aldo collaborated with us on this study, and it was done with Paul Glimcher. There was amygdala, and it was, as I saw before, it seemed as if it's only for ambiguity, but now I'm going to show that that's really not the case. So another thing that you can do with fMRI data is you can localize region of interest and then sample this activation and examine it, and that's what we did next. We localized the regions using subjective value under ambiguity, and we saw that these areas' activity is correlated with subjective value under risk as well, regardless of how we define the areas. It's true for both areas, the medial prefrontal cortex and the striatum, and if we define the areas using subjective value under risk, we get the same thing. But what happens if we look at these areas that seem to be specific for ambiguity? Actually, both the posterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala also had significant information in them about the subjective value under risk. So actually, we didn't find any single brain area that was specific for the evaluation of risky or ambiguous options. And we think that that's a very strong support for the notion of the existence of some kind of unified valuation system in the brain that is composed at least of the medial prefrontal cortex and the striatum, but maybe these other areas as well. And this is not to say that there are other areas that will be differentially involved in the process, but they probably all converge to this unified valuation system, and this is consistent with a lot of work, including a lot of work that Joe has done also. Yes?
Okay. Has anybody ever asked Tom Poldrack to use this methodology and see whether they get their results?
To use, you mean risk and ambiguity instead of mixed lotteries?
To use as a covariate the subjective value of the lot. This is not what they
but they did.
But they get a different result.
But it's true. They didn't look for correlation with subjective value, but they did look for correlation with the positive and negative amounts. And it goes in the same. When we did the analysis with just the amounts, we got the same results. It's just that it's stronger with the subjective values. And they do show, Tom and Al do show the asymmetry in the response to gains and losses, so that you can say is evidence of subjective value or being represented there.
Were you asking about the camera paper on risk and ambiguity?
No,
okay.
The ambiguity science paper. The one with the methods.
Tom and Paul Druck. But I think Joe's.
He was referring to.
So there it was indeed no subjective value because they were just comparing two conditions. Okay, so how does this? Yes.
So maybe this is a naive question, but maybe I'm just not understanding. At the beginning, you talked about riskiness and ambiguity, and you distinguished them, and you found that they were not correlated on an individual difference level. And yet, in the brain, we're seeing that it's the very same brain regions that are, responsive to both kinds of cues. So, what are we to think? Do these boil down to the same thing? Like, I don't know if my behavior is going to pay off or not at a general level, or are there important differences between riskiness and ambiguity?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Thank you. So what we show here is just that at the end of the way, when you take into account the individual's attitudes towards risk and ambiguity and you calculate a subjective value based on this, you see it represented in the same system. But of course, there has to be something that feeds into this that responds differently to risk and ambiguity, in different individuals.
So are you suggesting then that the individual differences play out earlier in the process in the appraisal of a decision as one that would be one that would pay off or not, exactly. And then it's represented in the same brain regions.
Exactly, and you can think of it as just two factors that go into the evaluation, and you can think about a bunch of other factors. So if I evaluate food, then the taste will be one factor, and the, how it looks will be another factor, and so on and so on. And then everything has to somehow be combined into one value. So that's all I'm saying. So how does this change across the lifespan? And this is a study that we do as part of a series of studies that asks, could there be a link between attitudes towards risk and ambiguity and extreme types of behaviors? Because we saw that there is so much variability in this behavior. So does it underlie something interesting in the real world? And this is also with Paul Glingchair. So everybody knows that adolescents take a lot of risks. There is a 200% increase in morbidity and mortality from childhood to adolescence, and this is although adolescents are actually stronger and healthier than both children and adults. So why is it? It's not because they're stupid. They're as smart as adults. They understand the consequences of their actions. They actually overestimate the probabilities for adverse outcomes. Still, they engage in these risky behaviors. Also, interestingly, the same brain areas that we've seen, especially the prefrontal areas that are involved in valuation and risk and ambiguity processing, are also the ones that are late to develop and develop into adolescence and even later. So we looked at a group of 134 or 35 individuals at 4 age groups to ask this question: adolescents, young adults, midlife adults, and older adults. And the most interesting result that we had was about adolescents. So we expected adolescents to be less risk averse compared to adults because they take more risks, they engage more in risky behavior. But actually, that's not what we found. If you look here, this is just a non-parametric presentation of the results. So it's just a proportion of trials in which the subjects chose the lotteries and not the sure amount. And this is adults and adolescents. And each dot is one probability level. So if adolescents are indeed less risk averse than adults, all these points should lie above the diagonal. As you see, they're all either on or significantly below the diagonal. So adolescents, at least in our experiment, were actually more risk averse compared to adults.
What are they the same? How do you compare? What are the backgrounds of the adolescents and the adults? How are they standardized, I guess?
So that's a good question. We measure we have a lot of demographics information on wealth and income levels of them and their parents and education and siblings.
Better educated? I'm just trying to understand the educated. I mean, they've actually seen more.
So we take into account their parents' education in this to see whether it makes any difference. For the subjects themselves, we take IQ and numerosity just to see that they get the probability issue. We don't have any significant differences between groups in this. I don't know if it answers your question.
What are you assuming about their beliefs?
I don't think I assume anything.
So to say somebody is more or less risk tolerant, I could say the adolescents simply don't believe whatever probabilities the adults do.
Could be.
Right.
Well, it's more than it could in the sense that we know, for example, that adolescents grossly overestimate the probability of cancer from cigarette smoking.
It could be. One thing that I have to say is that they do take the probability into account in their decision. So we see a strong effect of probability on whether or not they would choose the lottery. Whether it's because their weighting of the probability is different than the adults, I don't know. So I can't differentiate between the two.
Can I ask, is the value of $5
Their actual perception, not weighting.
I was just going to ask, the value of $5 is different to an adolescent?
Yes,
than
okay,
to
that's
adults?
a good point. And I'm getting to it. That's a good point because at this point you could say, okay, it's just that they value $5 more, then that's why they choose it more. Okay, but wait just for a second. Yes. Okay.
The amounts were the same.
The amounts were the same, but what controls for this, I think, is the fact that that adolescents were a lot less averse to ambiguity in this experiment, and this is the same amount. So if it was just the fact that $5 or more for adolescents, they should be more ambiguity averse, and they're not.
Do you find this by gender?
Sorry?
What about the differences by gender?
So there was no difference. So actually, we did expect to see differences. Usually, women are reported as more risk averse. Ambiguity is not it's not clear, but we didn't see anything significant.
We had the study, right, with Borgens that was showing that women were actually more ambiguity tolerant than men, but more risk averse.
Okay.
So again, this is again like a very simple Ellsberg paradox kind of game. Yeah.
That's interesting because we did see. So we also had a paradigm with medical treatment choices, and we saw here there was a slight trend towards women being more tolerant, but in the medical, it was a slight trend towards women being less tolerant, and so we kind of didn't make anything of it. But if you see a similar thing, then that's really interesting.
I'll send you the paper.
Thank you. That would be great. And if we look at all the age groups, and this is again the parametric results, and so positive is seeking and negative is aversion. Under gains, all groups are risk averse, but adolescents and older adults are more risk averse than the young and midlife adults. Under losses, everybody is risk seeking, but older adults are actually more risk seeking than the rest. Under ambiguity, as you saw, everybody is ambiguity averse, except adolescents are less averse than the rest. And interestingly, under losses, all subjects were more or less neutral or not affected by ambiguity, except that older adults were slightly averse to ambiguity under losses. Okay, so we saw that. And then the last thing that I want to show is our attempt at a tiny behavioral intervention to see if these biases can be changed. And this is in collaboration with Lori Santos and her postdoc Ellen Furlong. What Ellen did is she had subjects play 180 trials, just gains again in this case. And then she had 3 different groups that went through 3 interventions. The first group, active calculation, learned about the Ellsberg paradox, why does it make sense to be averse to ambiguity. They actually saw the Ellsberg paradox that they committed and in their own choices, and they performed the calculations showing that it didn't make sense or it wasn't in their advantage to make the choices that they made. The second group, no calculation, went through the same intervention but didn't do the calculations themselves. The calculations were provided to them. And then the third group was just a control group that learned about base rate neglect. And then they played the same trials again. And what Ellen found was that before the intervention, everybody was about the same. This is the lottery choices, again, non-parametric, so just proportion of lottery choices under ambiguity. And after the intervention, only the active calculation group showed a significant effect. And this is, and it's a small effect. It's still, they could go up to here, and they didn't. So it was hard to change behavior. And this group that didn't go through the calculations did not change at all. And it's not because they didn't attend to the intervention, because Ellen also used an open question questionnaire to ask them questions that should show if they understood the explanation. And the no calculation group actually understood better than the active calculation group. And still, they didn't incorporate it in their choices. And then under risk, there shouldn't have been any change, but there was a slide. It's not significant here, but it is a trend towards more or less risk aversion, more risky choices after the intervention. So it looks like, It is very hard to change these biases, but when you do change them, they could be overgeneralized more than they should. So just to summarize, high variability in attitudes towards risk and ambiguity, but then a unified valuation system in the brain. Risk-taking in adolescence seems to be driven by tolerance to ambiguity. It's not that they like risks or prefer risks, and it's hard to change biases. I think unlike some popular books claim, and these are all the people that participated and did the work. Thank you.
So if you present ambiguity aversion as a fallacy, you are really making it happen. You are taking a position of saying, look, I'm taking expected utility as a benchmark.
No.
This thing, Alice paradox, is a mistake.
I agree with you.
So, I mean, could one try to give a fair shot to ambiguity aversion and say, look, if you behave ambiguity in an ambiguity averse way, you are really thinking that someone out there is changing the probability depending on what you choose. This may or may not be perceived as a reasonable attitude. At least you are giving ambiguity aversion its best shot. That is presenting it in a framework in which ambiguity aversion is indeed.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. If you're saying that it's not necessarily a fallacy, I completely agree. I mean, we're presented that way just because in this very narrow sense of Ellsberg, it's a fallacy. But I think in real life, it actually can make a lot of sense to be averse to ambiguity. And you don't have the colors switch on you in real life. So, if you want to be, on the safe side and maximize your minimal outcome or so, it's not necessarily irrational. On the contrary, it might be that for adolescents, for example, who are so open to ambiguity relatively, maybe in some contexts we want them to be more ambiguity averse. I think some of the implication of these results of adolescents, I think it makes sense that they would be open to ambiguity more than adults because they need to learn more. And then maybe the policy implication is that if you want to change their behavior, maybe just telling them don't do this or this is forbidden is not the right way. Or even telling them the probability for dying is so and so because it doesn't have any effect on them. Maybe the more helpful technique would be to have them experience things in a safe environment like virtual reality or something like that, and learn the probabilities by experience, and then that might change their behavior. And not necessarily, I'm not saying that that people have to be less averse to ambiguity. It strongly depends on the context.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
So, have you tried brain imaging after treatment?
No, that's what we would like to do.
You will see something completely different when you see when the treatment has been effective?
So, one thing that I expect to see is to see difference in the representation of subjective value. So the subjective value should be different. But, something more interesting would be to see if there is anything in the, before intervention that could predict whether or not they'll be responsive to the intervention. Or, there is some evidence from Scott Hutel, for example, that inferior frontal gyrus may do something in trying to figure out the ambiguous situation. So maybe something there is going to either predict the change or show the effect of the change. Or that's something that we plan to do.
So, what evidence is there, either from your work or others, for a correlation between risk aversion and risk ambiguity or ambiguity aversion and any kind of real life behaviors or measures of personality?
That's a very good question. So we did some of it for the adolescent study, and it's hard to know because it's hard to know what really measures, and that's actually, people in the room would know better than me. You are probably the best person to ask. How do you really measure real life attitudes. Because so we had the questionnaires. We have the adolescence risk-taking questionnaire. And we find one factor is correlated with ambiguity attitudes in the direction that you expect. Another factor is actually correlated in the opposite direction. And the effects are small, exactly. But then, I thought, but is this questionnaire really measuring real life? I mean, we didn't have anything else to use, but is this the best way to measure real life? Maybe this questionnaire is also not predictive of real life behavior. It's all self-report questionnaires. And I don't know if anyone who did, something like a prospective study to measure these attitudes and then see if they predict anything.
Well, things like grades and so forth. I don't know if you consider that, but performance in school and so forth, and choice of majors and things like that. That's not risk-taking.
I'm looking at Lisbeth because she studies adolescent risk-taking. I don't know.
Well, I know that it's not the exact same kinds of tasks, but like Adriana Gavin finds that reward activity in the ventral striatum and anticipation of a reward predicts openness to risk, like willingness to engage in risky behavior, which later also predicts risky behavior. And I did a study where I had people very rapidly rate is it a good or bad idea to do this risky behavior, and it was really highly correlated, like at 0.5, with having done that behavior, but you don't know which came first.
My reading of the adolescent literature was that there are two variables. One is sensation seeking, and the other is self-regulation to restraint. And you might see smaller or greater amounts of risky behavior because you're not a sensation seeker and your self-regulation is relevant. Or it could be that you have really strong levels of self-regulation for your age, and you're also a high sensation seeker. And it seems like some of the personality traits might measure one or the other of those, so you might not expect.
I think that's a good suggestion, because, for example, ambiguity attitudes, I think, should go with sensation seeking probably, and so I think that's a good suggestion.
And those are different. And when you look at the risk behavior, it's the aggregate.
I have a technical question, I think. When you were presenting the data on adolescents versus adults' tolerance for ambiguity, I believe that's controlling for how they responded to a 50-50 known risk.
That's excellent. You're right. Actually, I didn't mention it. That's a very important point.
And I was wondering, are adolescents more? Is it that adults treat it like a less than 50-50, and adolescents treat it as 50-50, or is it shifted up or down?
So both treat it as less than 50-50. That's a very good question. So what I present here is the proportion of choices of ambiguous options minus the choices of the 50-50. So if they're completely unaffected by ambiguity, they should make the same choices, whether it's ambiguous or whether it's explicitly 50-50. So both groups, or all groups, choose the ambiguous options less than the 50-50. It's just that in the adolescence, they're closer to the 50-50. And that's in the, so the measure here, if it works, if this was 0, that's what that would be neutrality. Yes.
I'd like to comment on what Aldo said and then move actually one step further. So one question is really, what is optimal, right? And this is a question of ecological rationality or maladaptation to the lab, right? What proves to be very successful outside the lab may be recognized very differently when you enter the lab. That is one issue. But I think the problem is maybe even one step more serious. What you describe as an error or mistake is only an error or mistake if the model of risk-taking behavior that we assume to analyze this data is the correct model of risk-taking. Okay? Suppose there's nothing like curvature of utility, there's no expected value maximization, nothing like that. Think of what George Lowenstein and others call risk as feeling. Then you wouldn't expect that if you teach people how to behave correctly in a normative way, given a particular type of model, that they would change the behavior. If you just don't like it, if it has a bad taste, right? Tell me 10 times you should drink it, I don't like it, I don't take it, I agree. So in that sense, I think this group could be very productive because there's so many versions of risk preferences out there. There's this canonical economic model, concave utility, and things like that. There's higher order risk preferences, variance, skewness, etc., etc. And then there's the whole psychological literature that assumes nothing of that sort. Then there's this interpretation that when we take risks, it's aversive, it's intellective-ish, it's bad feelings, etc., etc. And I think the study could actually help to make a point here in favor of risk as a feeling, as an emotion, rather than the optimal choice problem solution.
I think I agree. I think one thing.
I mean, one's just a different representation of another. It could be like an emotional basis for making what's a very logical decision, right? It's like a gut feeling that's rehearsed. Right. That's kind of a response to rationality over, in previous situations.
Maybe I understand it. So my point is.
Well, I wanted you to clarify what you meant exactly by the.
The way you presented it makes perfect sense, right? Is posing the problem as finding an optimal solution to a well-defined problem.
Right.
Okay? And then if you teach people, they should easily find it out. So if people have problems calculating 3 plus 4, you teach them and they say 7. Okay? That's basically the intuition behind this intervention. But if the question to be solved, or if the problem at hand is not a maximization problem, it's not an optimization problem of any kind, but a taste-driven thing, like I just don't like ambiguity. I don't want to take that option. There's another motive on top of, there should be a mild effect, a defining mild effect, because there's maybe a trade-off between maximizing money, right? I'm more willing to do something that I don't like if I earn a little bit of money. Now they don't have
It's a distinction.
But they still don't like it.
They could just acquire a taste for optimal solutions, I guess, is what I'm thinking. I'm just saying they could acquire a taste for optimal solutions. No, but they get a gut reaction, so that they're not going to calculate in your sense, you're just going to intuit. That's an old point, but I'm not sure that I'm just asking a psychologist, is there really a difference perceived, though, in the sense of the emotional basis versus if it leads to the same decision, or one's just another way to express it, I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what you're saying, Arvind.
Well, one thing you're saying, I think, is that what your working model is, the system might change what kind of intervention you think would be most effective. So if you think that, if you begin by thinking that people sort of need education on what would be the rational decision here, then that leads to a solution. And if you begin by thinking people have they have a taste, they have a love, they enjoy this or they don't enjoy this, then you'd have to think about what would you do to address that.
No, but you could educate them to acquire their taste or exercise their taste.
It's not obvious that educating. It's not obvious.
Well, you give them a set of rules. That would be the form of the education. But you eat this bar of chocolate and you will like it. Something like that.
That might not work.
That may take some hundreds.
No, they've done it before, though. They take it. They don't believe you. They implement it a few times. Anyway, I'm not quite sure what's being said.
I like that. This would be a nice follow-up, right? Then you would find out if it's an emotionally driven or rather cognitive.
Yeah, it would give you maybe you could find a precise way to do that, to target
That's
that.
exactly, the point of the experiment was exactly that, to show that it's not enough to just tell you what to do or what the right thing to do in terms of earning more money. It's something much stronger than that, and even though you know that it's not in your best interest, you're still doing it. So it's a very strong bias. You can call it emotional. It's something that you can't change just by being aware to it, I think.
I have one question, one remark. The remark is actually following up on this discussion. So one could imagine a completely different situation. So we, from expected utility framework, we would say small stakes risk aversion is kind of fallacy, right? Because people don't integrate things, or don't integrate risk or something like this. And then, but you could also write an alternative model in which people have, fixed cost of risk. So whenever they see a risk, that generates some emotional cost. And then an additive part, which is really expected utility. And then if you only teach them something about expected utility, they learn something about expected utility, but they won't change their behavior because you don't take away their feeling. Maybe if you tell them, okay, you should integrate risk, they might learn, but I'm not sure that they should ignore that psychological costs. I think that's the analogy. That's actually what Armin wanted to say, with having the right or wrong model. And now a question. You said that this intervention made them, change their behavior somewhat, but not entirely. And that's an average result, right?
Right.
It would be interesting to see whether there are individuals that completely go to the max, and others they don't change behavior at all.
Yeah, there is a lot of
more informative than just
variability, and also there is a negative correlation. So those that were more ambiguity averse change more. So it does make sense in the sense that they're really learning something.
This is a really uninformed question. Is there a brain area that's involved in all of these decisions involving risk that's not involved when you just ask, here's $10, here's $5? Well, I guess you have certain payments in your conditions, right?
Yes.
So is there a part of the valuation system that's specifically active for risk?
So we didn't find it. I'm sure there must be somewhere in. So there are thoughts that maybe in parietal cortex you can see more the risk, and then in lateral prefrontal more the ambiguity. Or there has to be some. That these are different things. When you're in the experiment, you behave differently and you perceive it differently. So there has to be something different in the brain. But at least in the part of the valuation, what just represents the value, there doesn't seem to be a difference.
And actually, something related to Thomas's point, there is a paper where they show that if you ask people their lifetime wealth right before you ask them about risk aversion and a lottery, it's all hypothetical, they're a lot more risk neutral. So that's an example of an intervention, at least.
I don't know this one, I think.
Guizzo.
Okay.
It's just the survey data, so it's in the bank data. One time they happened to ask lifetime.
Okay, that's interesting.
Wealth right before their lottery question,
Okay.
and they didn't, and they find it self-reported they're more risk neutral when you remind them. So it suggests that this integration intervention could have an impact.
Interesting.
But not about ambiguity versus risk, but that's more like
some general.
The fact that you find that the adolescents are more risk averse, like if the income argument's right, that shows that people are really paying attention to that. Whereas really, it should, for all of them, their lifetime income is so large, they should all be risk neutral, and so maybe, so I think again, it suggests that maybe framing them on a broader bracketing.
That's true.
Can I just make a suggestion that the next question and the questions that come after we take over coffee and apparently breaks. So we're going to come back at 1:45. That gives us almost half an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.